It will be another big week of elections, this time in Illinois, where voters head to the polls for Tuesday's primary. And the results could signal something bigger. In the past 13 months, Democrats have flipped 28 Republican-held state legislative seats in special elections all across the country. Republicans, however, have not flipped a single Democratic seat. That momentum could carry straight into the November midterms, and it may help explain why President Donald Trump is pressing Republicans in Congress to pass his strict voter ID bill, the so-called Save America Act. Supporters of the bill, which Republican leader John Thune says will be debated this week, argue that it would strengthen election security. However, voting rights groups say that it would have deleterious consequences. The act, by requiring documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote, could create new barriers for millions of Americans, particularly voters of color, married women who have changed their names, and anyone who lacks immediate access to documents like passports or birth certificates. Joining us now to discuss is Janae Nelson, President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Janae, welcome. In a piece you wrote for The Nation this week, you said the Senate must recognize the Save America Act for what it is, a modern poll tax dressed in the language of election security, and that they should reject it accordingly. If Republicans pass the Save Act, how could this change the voter registration process, and what will that mean on the ground in the midterm cycle?
So the SAVE Act saves no one. It is an effort to truly sabotage our elections by keeping people away from the polls and making them unable to register to vote. And it is one of the worst pieces of proposed legislation that I have seen as it comes to the right to vote. What it will do is require, as you said, documentary proof of citizenship in order to register to vote, meaning you will have to show either a passport or a birth certificate or a real ID that says you are a U.S. citizen, which most states do not provide. And I don't know about you, but most people don't have ready access to any of the documents that I just named that can prove your citizenship. And we have registered people to vote. We have allowed people to vote by verifying their citizenship status, their address, their eligibility for many, many decades without this type of onerous burden on voters before they even have a chance to enter the electoral process. So this is not as a result of any problem. It's not meant to solve any issue. It is simply meant to suppress the vote. And we need to name it for what it is. It is a voter suppression law, and it is extraordinarily harmful.
Janae, how do Democrats take that message of this being an act of voter suppression to marginalize voters and try to close the gap with Americans who, by some polls suggest, do support some kind of voter ID or do support some kind of enhanced voter ID mechanism? The polling suggests that Americans want some kind of voter ID, maybe not this mechanism that is being recommended by the Republicans. How do Democrats close that to come up with something effective?
I think we have to educate voters. They have to better understand the rigorous process that already exists in every single state in this country. You cannot simply register to vote and show up at a poll and cast a ballot and not have your identity verified in some way. States vary in terms of what they require. Some require a photo ID that is issued by the state. Some require a utility bill with your name and current address on it. Some require signature verification in addition to other forms of identification. There is not a single state in this country that doesn't have a significant voter verification process and that doesn't require some form of identification. So the idea that we need voter ID because there is voter fraud happening, people are showing up at the polls and they're not who they say they are, is patently false. This has been studied rigorously, and there's a minuscule set of examples over the past 2 decades. I think the number is like 40 or less instances of people showing up and not being who they say they are. And they face prosecution if they do, right? There are criminal statutes that bar people from doing that. So this is an invented problem. It is meant to simply keep people from the polls. It is an effort to steal our elections before a single vote is cast. And so the Senate is obligated to vote this bill down.
To follow on Eamon's question, though, why do you think Democrats, frankly, are not talking about all of the attacks on voting rights, whether it is the attacks on VRA at the Supreme Court, the possible passage of the SAVE Act here? It really is just not something they bring up with voters right now, despite the fact that it hits right at the heart of their own base, black voters who would be disproportionately impacted by all of this. And in fact, even just the basic messaging around this, and I don't need to tell you, certainly, voter ID, when I talk to people, they think that means just bring your license with you, bring a picture, some kind of a photo ID. They don't understand. They're often surprised when you tell them, no, you need a birth certificate or a passport. And then you hear them wonder in the moment, well, where is my birth certificate? I guess I have to call my mom or travel back home. I mean, they don't even understand actually what is in this bill. And I'm just surprised there aren't more people going out day in and day out and making the case and just telling the truth about what is really in this thing.
Yeah, that's why I think this segment is so important, and I hope that the media keeps amplifying this. I can't speak to the party. We're a nonpartisan group, so we don't talk about what Democrats or Republicans do. I can tell you that LDF has been sounding the alarm, has been a siren when it comes to the SAVE Act, and saying that this is going to discriminate against black voters in particular and other marginalized voters, young voters, voters with disabilities, voters who are new to the electoral process. This is an extremely harmful bill, and legacy civil rights groups have also been speaking about this. I was on a press call earlier today with media across the country talking about this issue. So we are trying to make this centered in the discussion about the midterms and in the effort to steal the election again before we even have a chance to go to the polls. And that's because there's just a fear of American voters. There's a fear of majority will. There's a fear of people holding this administration accountable.